Sheriff Traore revealed that he had received a racist Christmas gift from a teenager.
A Chinese supermarket has been accused of racism against locals in Nigeria.
To what is happening in France, where a fundamental issue in France has come to light once again. The issue is, of course, of racism.
Imagine being very excited and curious as your flight lands in a foreign country, only to be welcomed in a hostile manner, exclusion, or outright racial discrimination. Unfortunately, this has become a sad reality for many Black people traveling or living abroad. Although various forms of racism are prevalent in so many countries around the world, there are certain countries that pose significant challenges to Black people, from subtle exclusion to extremely dangerous racial discrimination. In some of these places, being a black-skinned individual can make you a target for violence and discrimination. Let's explore the difficult and uncomfortable truth about these countries where Black people are not welcomed. We'll dive beyond individual stories and look into recurring patterns of systemic and social hostility that Black migrants, students, travelers, and even citizens in some parts of these countries go through. Like the violent attacks in the streets of Russia and the racial slurs hurled at football players in Italy, these experiences contribute to the racial inequity that transcends borders. This video isn't about condemning the entire nation, but about bringing to light the awful experience faced by Blacks in these places. This is a sad reality that is often given blind eyes, despite how crucial it is for travelers and immigrants to be aware of these risks. This isn't to say that everyone in these countries has a racial perspective, nor to defame these countries. Although some Black people had positive experiences in some of these places, the aim of this video is to shine a light on the widespread discrimination that continues to negatively affect many. The inception of anti-Black racism in several countries can be linked back to European colonialism, which was the primary foundation of exploitation, subjugation, and racial hierarchy. Powerful European countries like Britain, Belgium, France, Portugal, and Belgium colonized several nations in Africa, and often perceived African people as inferior, which made them treat them as properties rather than human beings. The colonial mindset ate deep within the colonies, and the colonizing countries where the perception of racial superiority became deeply accommodated. The history of segregation and dehumanization laid the foundation for many of the racist attitudes that were practiced in these countries till date. So many countries continue to struggle with the legacy of colonialism, where prejudice has eaten deep against Black people and African descendants. Countries like Italy, which had colonial ambitions in Africa, the racial hierarchy was established during that period, which made them change their attitude towards the Black people till today. They began to socially and economically exploit Africa and its citizens. This fostered a global segregation and racism where being Black was commonly related with inferiority, criminality, and poverty. Anti-Black racism isn't just prevalent in former colonial powers, but has become a global phenomenon that is practiced in many cultures across various continents like East Asia to Eastern Europe, where Black people experience various forms of discrimination that are linked to historical and cultural factors. In many of these places, Black people are perceived as outsiders, even when they are citizens, long-term residents, or descendants of those who migrated several generations ago. This form of racism can be traced to negative portrayals of Black people in media, depicting them as violent, lazy, or hypersexualized individuals. These harmful stereotypes were not only oppressed by powerful colonial countries, but also reinforcing the idea of Black inferiority across different cultures through the global media. For example, the portrayal of the Blacks in Western films and television has influenced how Black people are viewed in places like China and India, where direct colonial history might be absent, but the global culture of anti-Blackness persists. One of the most powerful tools that forms these perceptions about race is the media. Black people have long been portrayed negatively in global media through news, advertisements, and movies. In countries like Russia and China, the media description of black people is often exaggerated and dehumanizing, making black individuals become targets of xenophobia and racism. These stereotypes and colonial-era ideas continue to influence modern-day racism, which makes it difficult for black people to feel welcome in these countries. Here are several anti-black racism countries. Italy, a country whose colonial past and ongoing struggles with immigration have created a tense atmosphere for black people, especially African migrants. Italy colonized African countries like Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. This has left a legacy of racial hierarchies that continue to influence racial societal attitudes. Today, Italy is a major country for African immigrants who are running from conflict, poverty, and persecution. Their fleeing to Italy for safety led to a widespread anti-immigrant sentiment. Italy, prominently known for its racial disposition, especially towards African migrants and black citizens. In public environments, black people often face verbal abuse and physical violence. African migrants who arrive by boat, seeking refuge from war zones, experience a greater portion of this hostility. Many Italians perceive these migrants as a burden on society, which increase the tension and racial animosity. Italy has also displayed racial attitudes against black-skinned individuals and African descendants in the world of sports, especially football. Black Italian and international football players have reported cases of being subjected to racial abuse and were thrown objects during matches. In addition to this, black residents and tourists report their experience of discrimination in the workplace, housing, and even in accessing public services. So far, the Italian government has made some attempts to curb racism, but these efforts are overshadowed by the increasing influence of politics and the unwillingness to confront the systemic racism that is eating deep in Italian society. China's rapid modernization and fast-growing global presence have led Chinese citizens to interact more with black people, especially through African immigration and China's investments in African countries. However, China has an ancient history of being biased and racial prejudice against dark-skinned individuals who traditionally had lower status in the community. This traditional colorism has contributed to the negative perceptions of black people within Chinese society. African immigrants, students, tourists, and even black people in China often report instances of discrimination, like being denied housing, refused service at restaurants, or facing verbal and physical abuse. Racism in China can sometimes be displayed as curiosity or ignorance, like staring or wanting to touch black people's hair. It can also turn worse and become a hostile situation. A good example is the incident that occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, when African residents in Guangzhou were evicted from their homes and denied service in public establishments based on the false claim that they were responsible for spreading the virus. This incident brought light to the extent to which black people are maltreated in Chinese society. Chinese media also played a significant role in the perpetuation of racial stereotypes. Black people are often portrayed as the aggressors and offenders in advertising, film, and news media. These perceptions, combined with a general lack of exposure to diverse cultures, makes it difficult for black people to explore the social environment in China without encountering prejudice or biased attitudes. India's history of prejudice and its deeply ingrained caste system significantly influenced how black people are perceived and treated in the country. Despite the fact that India does not have a large African population, the few African immigrants and students who reside in the country often report cases of racism. Indian society has a historic preference for lighter skin, which contributes to the country's complex social hierarchies. This social hierarchy and bias also influences how black people are perceived. In recent years, numerous African students who are studying in India have experienced violent attacks, harassment, and public hostility from the local residents. These attacks are often caused by racial prejudice and cultural misunderstandings or the assumption that Africans are often involved in criminal activities. African students, especially from Nigeria and Kenya, have reported cases of being denied housing and also subjected to racial slurs and physical attack in public places. A well-known case was the incident that occurred in 2017 when a group of African students were attacked by a mob in Greater Noida, a city near Delhi, after rumors spread that Africans were responsible for drug trafficking in the area. The incident caused an international outrage and exemplifies the intense racial tensions Black people living in India go through. In India, dark-skinned individuals are often associated with lower repute and social status, and this extends to Black individuals, who are seen as a burden and undesirable. Even Bollywood, the country's dominant film industry, has been criticized for reinforcing these colorist ideologies, often casting lighter-skinned actors in favorable roles and marginalizing those with darker complexions in an unfavorable acting role. Israel, a country with a diverse population that includes the Jewish immigrants from around the world, Africans who are seeking refuge, and Ethiopian Jews, as well as other tourists. Israel has a complicated racial dynamics. Although Israel had embraced Jewish immigrants from Ethiopia as part of its mission to bring Jews from around the world to the homeland, this acceptance has also come with its own challenges. Ethiopian Jews and African asylum seekers have reported experiencing significant racism and discrimination. Black-skinned people in Israel, especially African asylum seekers, experience systemic discrimination and social hostility. Many African migrants who arrived in Israel in search of refuge from violence in countries like Sudan and Eritrea have been labeled infiltrators by the government and are often subjected to harsh and awful treatment. Some of them have been detained, deported, and denied basic rights. Despite Ethiopian Jews' status as Jewish citizens, they also face discrimination, particularly in housing, education, and employment. Ethiopian Israelis held protests against police brutality and racial profiling, which gained international attention and revealed the depth of racial tensions within the country. The Israeli government's response to African asylum seekers has been highly controversial. Policies intend on deporting African migrants, as well as the construction of detention centers, which drew criticism from human rights organizations. The government's stance on African refugees is perceived by many as a display of broader racial prejudice within Israeli society. Ukraine has a complex history with race relations, especially in maintaining a strong national identity. Ukraine is largely ethnically homogeneous, with relatively little racial diversity. Black people, particularly African students and migrants, have faced intense racism in Ukraine. This racism is commonly caused by stereotypes and a lack of familiarity with people of African descent. Many Black people in Ukraine have reported cases of racial profiling, harassment, and violence. African students, who often visit Ukraine for higher education, are usually vulnerable to racist attacks. Many have shared stories of being insulted, violated, or even denied entry into public facilities. During the 2022 war between Russia and Ukraine, African migrants and students who tried to exit the country reported being denied access to transportation and safe passage, while white Ukrainians were given priority. These incidents are not isolated, as the racial attitude in Ukraine spreads to public services, housing, and social interactions. Black people are often seen as outsiders and treated as if they don't belong in Ukrainian society. Racism in Ukraine is seen in how Black people are being treated by authorities and the general public. There are few legal policies against discrimination, and racial profiling by the police is a common complaint. The ongoing war has further aggravated the situation, making racial prejudice surface despite the chaos, leaving Black migrants particularly vulnerable to mistreatment. In some other countries, the relationship between Black people and the larger society is not extremely hostile like the nations previously mentioned, but very complex. These countries often have both positive and negative sides to how Black people are treated. The challenges Black people in these places face can be subtle, which can oftentimes be seen through social discrimination, cultural biases, and socio-economic exclusion. At the same time, These nations may also provide opportunities for growth, community, and even acceptance, leading to a double-sided experience for Black individuals. France, a French-speaking country whose relationship with Black people is deeply influenced by its colonial past, especially in Africa and the Caribbean. As a result, the country is majorly populated by Blacks. Many of the population are descendants of immigrants from former French colonies like Algeria, Senegal, Haiti, and the Ivory Coast. While France officially promotes a colorblind approach to society, claiming to embrace liberté, égalité, fraternité, which means liberty, equality, brotherhood, for all. In practice, Black people often face racism and systemic inequality. Black people in France often go through a paradoxical experience. On one hand, France is a homeland to a vibrant Black community that contributes significantly to the development of French culture, particularly in the arts, sports, and academia. On the other hand, Black people frequently face racial profiling, especially by the police, and are dominant in poorer neighborhoods and underrepresented in higher levels of business and political positions. Racial profiling by police, which is commonly known as identity checks, disproportionately targets Black people, especially in urban and developed areas like Paris, Marseille, and Lyon. These attitudes oftentimes escalate into harassment, which leads to feelings of marginalization. Additionally, Black people frequently report challenges in the job market, with investigation reports proving that applicants with names that sound like African are less likely to receive interviews or callbacks compared to those with traditionally French names. Regardless of these challenges, Black culture plays an influential and iconic role in French society. From the football stars like Kylian Mbappé to renowned artists like Aimé Césaire and writers like Léon Gontran Damas, Black individuals have been a pivotal part of the society's progress. These Blacks have left an indelible mark on French culture, yet the country's reluctance to address and curb issues of race directly creates a dichotomy where Black excellence is celebrated, but systemic racism remains unaddressed. This phenomenon leaves many Black individuals in a state of tension between acceptance and marginalization. Russia has long been engraved with racism, especially towards non-ethnic Russians and people of African descent. Historically, Russia's limited interaction with Africa and its deeply homogeneous society contributed to the othering of Black people, who have been seen as outsiders or even threats to national identity. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the rise of nationalism in the post-Cold War era only aggravated the situation. Currently, Black people in Russia, including students, expatriates, and even those who were born and brought up there, usually experience intense hostility. Racist violence is a severe issue, especially in major cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. African who reside in these cities, tourists and students have reported several instances of being harassed on the streets, in public transportation, and even within their educational institutions. In some extreme scenarios, Black individuals have been physically attacked by groups of nationalists who are known for their xenophobic and white supremacist perceptions. One significant scenario of Russia's hostility against the Black community is the experience of African students who attend Russian universities, many of which reported instances of being beaten, verbally abused, and even being victims of racial slurs by their peers or even strangers. The Russian football scene is also another example of Russia's notorious racism, with Black players frequently being subjected to racist chants and being made fun of during matches. Despite the cry of the masses, the Russian government did not respond adequately to these issues. Most times, racial violence goes unpunished, and efforts made to fight against xenophobia are but to no luck. Russia's political climate and decline in anti-discrimination laws makes Black-skinned individuals remain vulnerable to attacks with little or no legal backing. Brazil, a country outside Africa that has the largest population of African descent due to the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade brought millions of Africans to the country. Today, Brazil's black population includes various people of mixed African and European ancestry, which makes up over half of the country's total population. Regardless of these significant demographics, Brazil had a really complex racial dynamic, which is a deeply rooted issue of inequality, colorism, and racial inequality. Brazil's relationship with its black population is a facade of racial harmony, which is often referred to as the myth of racial democracy. According to this myth, Brazil's racial diversity is a sign of equality, and the country does not have the same racial issues as nations like the United States. However, this narrative covers crucial racial disparities, where black Brazilians are disproportionately affected by poverty, unemployment, and violence. Dark-skinned black individuals in Brazil are often challenged with racial discrimination in education, employment, and even housing. Although black culture is celebrated through music, dance patterns like samba and capoeira, and religious practices like candomblé, racism has deeply been engraved in Brazilian society. In some cities like Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, black people are more likely to live in rural or impoverished favelas, where they are challenged with high levels of police violence and limited or no access to quality public services. In recent years, there has been a rapidly growing movement among Afro-Brazilians to address and curb these racial inequalities. The Black Consciousness movement, which is led by activists and scholars, seeks to challenge the myth of racial democracy and demand more recognition of the systemic racism that exists in Brazil. Affirmative action policies like quotas for black students in universities have also been introduced to address racial disparities in education. However, the progress remains slow and tentative. These are the few out of the many countries where black people are not welcomed. Have you had any awful experiences in any country you visited? We'd like to read your experience in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Share this video to anyone you know who is living abroad.